Welcome, everyone, to Northgate Hall, the home of UC Berkeley journalism. My name is Michael Bolden, and I'm the Dean of the School of Journalism and a professor of journalism here at Berkeley. Before I go further, I want to acknowledge two people who are in the audience. So, Ed Wasserman, who is a former dean and a professor of journalism here in the school, is here with us. And I also want to acknowledge Tom Goldstein, who was a two-time dean of the School of Journalism and a former dean of the Columbia Journalism School, but we don't talk about that. So thanks for being here. I want to welcome Dr. A.J. Bauer, an assistant professor of journalism at the University of Alabama's College of Communication and Information Sciences. One of the reasons why that's meaningful to me is that that's where I attended undergraduate school. I minored in journalism, and that created the foundations of my career. Without the relationships I formed there and my early experiences on that campus, I would not be here. So, Dr. Bauer, I'm thrilled to have you here. Roll Tide. Rogue Tide, yeah. Dr. Bauer is the author of Making the Liberal Media, How Conservatives Built a Movement Against the Press, just out from Columbia University Press. An historian, ethnographer, and former journalist, he researches historical and contemporary right-wing movements in the United States and beyond. His new book looks at how conflict with the press became central to conservative identity and how antipathy toward the media shaped the modern conservative movement. I also want to welcome Dr. Lawrence Rosenthal, chair and lead researcher of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, which he founded in 2009. He has taught at Berkeley in the Sociology and Italian Studies departments and was a Fulbright professor at the University of Naples in Italy, not Florida. I think we can agree that the work of the Center for Right-Wing Studies is especially important now. It's important to our understanding of threats to press freedom and to democracies, not just in this country, but everywhere. Thank you for your work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bauer and Dr. Rosenthal.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Dean Bolden. Okay. Let me say I'm really thrilled to have to welcome AJ here to do this presentation. I want to thank everybody in the J School who have made this possible, and that we're holding the event here is a pleasure. As I am Larry Rosenthal. I am the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, and we are the sponsors of this event. Today, by the way, turn off cell phones and otherwise silence devices. Okay. What we're going to do today is have A.J. Bauer give a presentation, which will last for about 40 or 45 minutes. And then we will have a short discussion and then open the event to questions from you all. People who are watching this online can use the Q&A function of, I guess it's on Zoom. All right. A great pleasure to introduce A.J. Bauer. As Dean Bolden said, he is an assistant professor of journalism and creative media at the University of Alabama. He holds a PhD in American Studies from NYU and was previously a professional journalist. His journalistic contributions have been to include Bloomberg, Politico, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Columbia Journalism Review, The Guardian, and other places. He is the co-editor of News on the Right, Studying Conservative News Cultures. And today he's going to talk about his new book, which is Making the Liberal Media, How Conservatives Built a Movement Against the Press. Join me in welcoming Professor Bauer.
All righty, I'm just going to get this set up for just a second. I'm also going to record myself because why not? Um, how lucky I am to get a double introduction. Roll Tide. I had said to you when you said it, we're trying to make woke tide happen because a few years ago there was a professor who left the University of Alabama. I gather he didn't get tenure for one reason or another, and then went on Fox News and claimed that the reason was because Alabama had gone woke. And there was a Fox News chyron that said "woke tide?" question mark. So we're trying to, claim woke tide. Who we is, I mean, I'm trying to reclaim woke tide. So as I've been introduced, I'm a professor, assistant professor of journalism at the University of Alabama. I want to thank, first of all, Dean Bolden and the wonderful faculty and staff here at UC Berkeley School of Journalism for generously hosting this event. I also want to thank Larry Rosenthal and the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. I started researching this project and right-wing media more broadly in 2009, the same year that the Center for Right-Wing Studies was started. And back when I started, it was kind of a quirky, weird thing to study. I spent maybe the first half of my, we'll say, career, I was a grad student at the time, justifying why I would want to study the right. And it really feels that we've reach some kind of a threshold where there's some community around it. And so I really appreciate the work you've done, Larry, and the work of the Center for Right-Wing Studies to really build a space where scholars who are working on various aspects of right-wing movements, both in the US and around the globe, using a variety of different methodologies, can come together and think about this problem that we're all increasingly facing. So I've titled my remarks today Beyond Bias, which requires a little bit of conceptual unpacking. So it'll get a little bit more talky, a little more entertaining later, hopefully in the presentation. But I want to start off by giving you kind of my normative and epistemological assumptions that underpin the research that I'll be sharing with you today. I'm not going to get into the deeper rationale or why I believe these things. We can talk about those somewhat in the Q&A. But think of this as kind of almost a positionality statement, right? This is where I'm coming from conceptually. So most journalism professors are against bias, right? We teach our students to avoid bias oftentimes. Normatively, I'm not so much against bias as I am against objectivity. I don't think it's possible or even preferable. I think it results in an overly facile epistemological framework that impedes our ability to understand how the world works and how we know what we know. You could say that I'm pro-bias insofar as I think that all news is shaped by the political, economic, cultural, and subjective conditions of its production. Bias, of course, presumes the existence of non-bias, or objectivity, as we often call it, right? Which does not, in fact, exist, except as an ideal, right? Objectivity, as all of us who have ever been journalists knows, right, is a horizon that we orient toward, but we never ultimately reach, right? Something that seems objective to me or seems, impartial, somebody else might think the opposite, right? So part of what I needed to do in order to research my book was to get outside of what I like to call the kind of objectivity or bias paradigm. And so outside of the framework of objectivity, a bias claim, which is often how I'll talk about bias today, is simply a statement of disagreement, right? So I'll give you some examples. I don't think that the New York Times is biased against trans people. I disagree with the New York Times' hateful and cowardly coverage of trans people because its framing undermines and harms those people, right? I don't think the New York Times is biased against Palestinians. I disagree with that outlet's policy of prioritizing framings that bolster the Zionist settler colonial project that is Israel. Those framings actively erase and cause harm to Palestinian people, right? So part of what I'm saying here, right, is just reframing, right? I'm saying basically the same thing. I disagree with the New York Times' coverage, but rather than positing some kind of objective norm that I am saying that they're not upholding, I'm just pointing to the thing that I disagree with, right? This is how I want us to start thinking about media discourse slightly differently, right? And this is quite contrary to the way that the right thinks about it, as we'll talk about today. So there's a way to talk about political difference and disagreement without resorting to bias claims. We don't need them, right? So a more accurate description of my position then is that I'm against the bias paradigm, or what I'm calling the bias paradigm. I want us to think beyond the bias and objectivity binary, and doing so requires acknowledging that bias does not exist outside of the presumption of non-bias. Now, bias claims exist, and that's what I want us to focus on today. So a bias claim presumes that it is possible to create an account of the world that is universal or unimpacted by an individual's social, cultural, and political positionality. That is, it is a critical paradigm that emerges out of a presumption that objectivity is not only possible, but ideal. Since it's unreachable for practical purposes, objectivity becomes a sort of empty signifier, right? It's a thing that we talk about as though we have a shared sense of what's inside that container, but really we have different ideas of what's inside that container, right? And so objectivity often becomes a vehicle that people fill with their sense of what they think is real, and then they feel affronted or conflicted when somebody has a different sense of what is real, right? This is why most of our debates around politics today are often framed in terms of epistemological crisis, right? As though we don't share the basic facts or reality. In reality, we disagree mostly in terms of framing, what intellectuals will call like hermeneutics, right? How do we interpret the facts? What do they mean? What should they mean for our politics and our life, right? So, as journalism historians like David Mindich and Michael Schudson have demonstrated, objectivity is not some universal ahistorical ideal. As a professional practice and a norm, objectivity is historical. It has shifted considerably over time, as have notions of bias, as my book talks about at length. So, I narrate the history of bias claims in the United States in my book, Making the Liberal Media, How Conservatives Built a Movement Against the Press, which is out from Columbia University Press this month. You can buy it back there in the back at the event. This is also a QR code if you want to think about it, buy it later, share it with a friend, all of those sorts of things, right? We are a one-stop shop here. You too can make QR codes if you use Google Chrome, apparently. I learned this while making this talk, so... Now, there are countless works, left, right, and academic, that attempt to measure bias of one sort or another. Other works in the kind of similar field that I'm writing in have focused on bias claims from the right as purely tactical. Right? They claim that conservatives target the press to encourage more favorable coverage. Eric Alterman calls this working the refs, right? Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky call this flack, right? They described accuracy in media, a famous conservative press watchdog, in their classic work Manufacturing Consent from 1988. They refer to accuracy in media and other right-wing media outlets as flack. My book is formally agnostic on the question of whether the media is biased either for or against liberalism. I think is the media biased is the wrong question. Instead, I'm interested in why conservatives perceived the media as biased and how that perception has shaped conservative political identity and movement formation for the last 80 years, right? And then some. Other historians of conservative media activism, most notably Nikki Hemmer's great book, Messengers of the Right, contend that conservatives basically invented the claim of liberal media bias from whole cloth. But I find that structural press criticism, the discourse that enables allegations of media bias at scale, actually originates on the left. A very helpful book in this regard is Victor Piccard's wonderful book, America's Battle for Media Democracy, about the progressive media reform movement of the 1940s. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But in any event, part of what I'm looking at in this book is how this idea of right-wing media bias emerges, or the liberal media bias rather, emerges in dialogue with this kind of progressive media criticism tradition. So over the course of the late 1940s and early 1950s, that discourse shifted rightward. And by the 1960s and 70s, it became a core element of modern conservatism. That's kind of the narrative that I give you in the book. It's also a narrative that I'll be giving you here today. Now, obviously, conservatives aren't the only ones who make bias claims. Liberals and leftists routinely accused legacy and mainstream media outlets of bias on a variety of different specific issues. I'm not saying in this book or in this talk that left media criticism went away entirely, right? You can think about fairness and accuracy in reporting, right? You can think about Media Matters for America, right? There are plenty of left and progressive media critics out there. Instead, what I'm arguing is that the prevailing political common sense shifts over the course of the 20th century. From a general belief that structural conditions resulted in right-wing media bias, right, that the media overall was biased in favor of the right, towards a generalized belief that those same conditions favor liberalism or the left. So in order to track this shift, which I do a little bit in the book as well, I should introduce you to Morris Ernst. How many people heard of Morris Ernst? Oh, only a few. This is exciting. So Morris Ernst, who's got a nice little pipe there, was born in 1888 in Alabama, of all places. We got Alabama ties throughout, right? But he became successful as a lawyer in New York. He was a longtime general counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union for a good swath of the mid-20th century. He importantly, was a liberal, right? He, civil libertarian especially, but liberal. He supported civil rights for Black Americans in the 1940s. He was a part of Truman's Commission on Civil Rights. He advocated for birth control access and for the rights of people producing sexually explicit content that drew obscenity charges. He's perhaps most known for his work in the realm of obscenity law, right, and making sure that people that are producing things that might be seen as obscene are protected, right? Big advocate for the First Amendment. Now, deep down, Ernst was a civil libertarian to his core, but he was also an anti-communist. After his death, it was revealed that he had close relationship with the FBI director J. Edgar Hoover. He actually wrote a piece for Reader's Digest in the 1950s called "Why I Trust the FBI," and he actually shared that with Hoover, who like made notes before he submitted it. Right, so he wrote. Again, liberal apologia. He was all about supporting the FBI. He was a part of that kind of bigger apparatus of counter-subversion in the 1950s, the kind of McCarthy era that we'll be talking about more as well today. So what I wanted you to come across here, right, is that Morris Ernst was a progressive liberal, an anti-communist, and also pretty important in the rise of the progressive media reform movement. So the reason why I find Ernst to be important is because of his 1946 book, The First Freedom. I think that this text is not from that, it's from a couple of years later, but it captures the kind of basic point of that book, which was a liberal work of structural press criticism that, as Victor Pickard has written, was kind of a key text for the progressive media reform movement of the 1940s. Now, that movement was a movement primarily of lawyers, of journalists, of other activists that basically saw an increasing crisis of newspapers, a crisis of journalism. What was happening in the 1940s and what's chronicled in Ernst's book is that there was an increasing consolidation. It's been going on for 100 years, right? Almost already. But what you see is newspaper chains increasingly buying up large swaths of the newspaper community. You see cities that would have 4 or 5 newspapers get 2 or 3 newspapers. So what we now have today, where Tuscaloosa, for example, has 3 news outlets that are 3 men, all 3 of them, who do various kinds of individual reporting. Some of them are very lovely, right? But not newspapers in the way that we used to formerly understood it, right? So historically, when there was only 2 or 3 newspapers in town, that was seen as a big crisis. We've now been living through that crisis for, 80 years, right? So Ernst was an early advocate of doing something about this, right? Breaking up the kind of monopolies that were basically, in his view, constraining the marketplace of ideas, increasingly owned by a smaller and smaller number of wealthy people, right? Billionaires who were controlling the news industry. So all of this is to say that before the liberal media, there was the reactionary media, right? There was a belief that, in particular, the news industry was biased against Roosevelt and against the New Deal. During the Franklin Roosevelt administration, Roosevelt was fond of saying that 85% of newspapers were against him. Now, whether or not that was actually true or not, the DNC did a study that showed that it was something around that. There was a considerable bias against the New Deal. This is one reason why you have the FDR engaging in his fireside chats, right? Going to the radio, speaking directly to the people, because the newspapers were generally speaking opposed to the New Deal, because their owners had material interests in opposing, Keynesian economics, right? So the idea that the media was structurally biased in favor of the political right starts out as a kind of a left political project. It's driven by progressive muckraking journalists like Will Irwin and Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair, obviously known for The Jungle, but in 1919, he wrote a book called Brass Check, which was the first book-length expose of the newspaper industry. Also, George Seldes, who was an important progressive media critic and who published the newsletter In Fact, which was the first mass audience media criticism outlet and kind of existed throughout the 1940s. Importantly, In Fact had a circulation of around 170,000. It was bigger than The Nation. It was bigger than the New Republic, right? It was a really significant factor in convincing large swaths of the public, especially labor union members, that the press was biased against the New Deal, against the CIO, against the kinds of things that the Popular Front, this kind of alliance of progressives and leftists during this period, were in favor of. Now, a little bit about In Fact, just so that you know, right? So In Fact was founded in 1940, partly because Bruce Minton, who was a neighbor of George Seldes, approached him and said, let's create a newsletter together. Now, according to Bruce Minton, who later signed a confession to this regard, he had gotten $3,000 from the Communist Party to basically create a front. He was going to, that would be an alternative in case the Daily Worker got shut down by the feds. Now, according to Minton, Seldes was unaware of this. I'm not going to say one way or the other. I don't know what Seldes knew or didn't know. But by all accounts, or at least by Minton's account, Seldes was not a very good front, right? He was a little bit too idiosyncratic. He was kind of doing his own thing, right? And so in fact, was really important in constructing a broader viewpoint that the media was biased in ways that were disadvantageous to workers in particular. And so one of these things is he was an early advocate for publishing ideas that tobacco was cancerous, right? So he found these medical studies that tobacco caused cancer. He argued that a lot of newspapers were hiding this information, partly because they were making money from advertising from tobacco industry, right? And so he was a kind of crusader for, ethical journalism and against the ways that commercialism skewed journalism against workers and against the interests of their readers. Now, Seldes was also really focused on what he saw to be a right-wing domestic fascist publishing network in the United States. He saw Reader's Digest as the center of this. So basically what he argued is that Reader's Digest, which was the largest magazine, mass audience publication during the time period, that basically Reader's Digest would conspire with further right outlets, smaller outlets like Human Events or like Plain Talk, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit, and would basically amplify those ideas to its millions of readers, right? A good example of this is in 1946, I think it was, Reader's Digest published an excerpt of Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom, right? So Seldes saw all of this as basically evidence that there was a broad conspiracy, right, among the press, and particularly with Reader's Digest, to skew coverage against the interest of workers and against the interests of the people. So by the late 1940s, this was, you also start to see things happening on the right. This is the kind of beginning stages, origin points of the modern conservative movement. You have the founding of outlets like Human Events, which have been written about relatively extensively. You also see right anti-communists quickly borrowing tactics and capturing the momentum of the progressive media reform movement. So two projects that I focus on, especially in this book, were funded by Alfred Kohlberg. Alfred Kohlberg was a textile importer, specialized in importing textiles from China. He was a big fan of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists and was very afraid that China would be taken over by the Communist Party. And so in the late 1940s, Alfred Kohlberg, who would later go on to be a member of the John Birch Society board of directors, right? He founded two organizations that are important to note. One is Plain Talk. Plain Talk was a small right anti-communist magazine that over the course of the 1940s starts to become a landing place for a lot of socialist and liberal journalists that were anti-communist, anti-Stalinist, as they slowly make their migratory journey over to the right. And so a couple of journalists that I write about in the book that I talk about are Eugene Lyons and Ralph de Toledano. Both of these are folks who end up writing and editing the National Review by the 1950s and 1960s. But in 1940s, right, they were writing for The New Leader, which was a democratic socialist publication. And they were often doing red baiting in that publication. They were kind of innovating in what would end up becoming the kind of popular discourse of the Second Red Scare, right? Pointing to people that were seen that they saw to be fellow travelers and basically alleging that they were communists, right? One of the people that The New Leader was focused on, was George Seldes, right? They felt that he towed a little too closely to the Communist Party line, and they were trying to get him to basically lose subscribers, right, and no longer have his magazine. Now, in the 1940s, you see Eugene Lyons initially critique Seldes in The New Leader, but then once Kohlberg opens Plain Talk, he migrates rightward, becomes a contributing editor there, and starts targeting Seldes from the right as well, right? And so importantly, what I show in the book is that Eugene Lyons, Ralph de Toledano, these folks who are important in developing this idea of progressive media criticism, right, who are part of that discourse that Victor Pickard writes about that are showing that the media is reactionary, as they shift rightward, they bring that tactic of media criticism with them. Importantly, the folks who are invested with Plain Talk were also very adamantly opposed to George Seldes and end up borrowing a lot of his tactics in order to push him to the margins of public life as well. In order to do so, they use another outlet that was created by Alfred Kohlberg, which is called American Business Consultants. You may be familiar with them because they created the radio industry blacklist Red Channels, which they published in 1950. And so when American Business Consultants get started, and when Plain Talk was working on its first issue, I found this at the archives at NYU. The counterattack research files are actually based at NYU's Tamiment Library. If anybody wants to go look at them there, we can talk about methods more in the Q&A if you'd like. But what I found is a memo basically the American business consultants went to the editor of Plain Talk and said, hey, here's all of these people that we have information on. Who would you like to expose? And they said, we don't want any of those. We want to expose George Seldes. We primarily want to target George Seldes. And they went and they looked and they didn't find any proof that George Seldes had ties to the Communist Party, right? And so they said, well, we don't really have that much. Eugene Lyons ends up using the resources that they do have and then publishing an attack of George Seldes. So part of what I'm tracking in the book is literally a right-wing appropriation of tactics from progressive media reformers, while at the same time, some of those progressive media reformers themselves were shifting rightwards, right? So again, part of what I'm arguing in the book is that you've got this progressive media reform movement. The right basically borrows that and runs with it. Now, one of the main successes of the progressive media reform movement in the 1940s was something that many of you are probably familiar with called the Fairness Doctrine, right? So in the 1940s, there was a policy by the Federal Communications Commission called the Mayflower Doctrine. This was a ban on broadcast editorials at all from 1941 until 1949. This was the kind of brainchild of James Lawrence Fly. He was an FCC chairman under FDR, and he was a great anti-monopolist. And so he was a part of this progressive media reform movement trying to break up, a monopolistic control over the press and over the radio, right? So he saw the Mayflower Doctrine, which banned broadcast editorials, as inhibiting the owners of broadcast stations from editorializing for their own political and pecuniary benefit, right? Now, by the late 1940s, the National Association of Broadcasters starts gaining a lot of clout, right? This is partly because as you have reconversion back from the war, a lot of advertisements as companies are trying to sell consumer goods and products, the National Association of Broadcasters gets really powerful, and they basically convince the Truman FCC to reconsider the Mayflower Doctrine, right? That ends up resulting in the Fairness Doctrine, which throughout the mid-20th century, from 1949 to 1987, basically mandated if you were a broadcaster, you had to cover issues of public concern, so news and commentary, political commentary, and you had to do so in a way that balanced both sides of whatever the issue may be, right? So this balance imperative is a really important foundation of what becomes what Dan Howland calls the high modern tradition of American journalism in the mid-20th century. It's kind of the basis of a lot of our contemporary angst around Fox News, right? This idea that, Fox News's initial slogan was fair and balanced. That was kind of a knowing tongue-in-cheek nod to the Fairness Doctrine, right? So all of this is the kind of sum of that progressive media reform movement that happens in the 1940s. But as we're gathering with American business consultants and with the Plain Talk, you start to see a shift. And so I argue in the book that 1950 is a really crucial moment here. 1950 is the end of In Fact. That's when George Seldes gets kind of red baited to margins of public life. It's also the year that Red Channels gets published, which is this kind of right media criticism blacklist, right? Now, in order to explain how this builds even further, I need to introduce you to H.L. Hunt. He's looking kind of creepy here. He was kind of creepy. I didn't use the photo of him where he was literally creeping. He used to be he had something that he was like his own personal version of yoga, kind of. So he did this thing like downward dog, basically, where he would kind of do as a stretch that he called creeping. And there's some photo evidence of this. You can Google it if you want to find it. I didn't include that, though. I include this creepy thing instead. Those of you that are Taylor Swift fans, you're part of the H.L. Hunt family because his family owns the Kansas City Chiefs. His H.L. Hunt's son created the Chiefs, and I think it's his grandson now, if I'm not mistaken, that still runs them. He was also the inspiration, some say, for JR in Dallas, not a sitcom at all, the soap opera, right? Texas-based soap opera. So anyways, H.L. Hunt was an oil man, right? He also was a bigamist. He had multiple wives, not at the same time in the same place, in multiple places. This was back when that was easier to do. There wasn't social media and that sort of thing. He was also a gambler, and some accounts suggest that he got some of his initial seed money for his oil investments from basically not himself doing sex work, but kind of brokering sex workers, that kind of thing. So anyway, he was an unseemly figure, and he was largely out of the public eye until 1949, right? In 1949, Fortune magazine runs a photo of him that was taken while he was walking to his local poker game in Dallas, actually, and puts him on the front page and says, "Is this the richest man in America?" And this is part of a Fortune magazine profile on this kind of nouveau riche of oil men that were developing in Texas during this time period, during the oil boom. And so that image, right, becomes the beginning of Hunt's entree into public life. Now, unlike folks like, William F. Buckley or these other conservative movement figures who are really well connected politically, Hunt was kind of an outsider, right? He wasn't a member of the Citizens Council in Dallas. By all accounts, he was kind of not part of political life in Dallas very much. He was rejected from a lot of the fancy country clubs because he was nouveau riche, all that sort of thing, right? So he enters the public eye in 1949, mere months after the Fairness Doctrine is created, right? Now, the reason why I'm introducing you to H.L. Hunt is in 1951, he founds a group called Facts Forum. So Facts Forum, as I argue in my book, is, I would argue, the first grassroots mobilization of the modern conservative movement. So it starts out as a series of local discussion groups. He basically says, we're going to gather people together in small groups, maybe 20, 30, 40 people, and they're going to talk about the news of the day together, right? They're going to bring the newspapers that they read. They're going to debate whatever issues they think are important. It was loosely coordinated from Dallas. So they would say, okay, this week, all the Facts Forum units are going to debate, Korea, right? What should we do in Korea, right? Whatever the topic would be. And so it's this kind of loosely coordinated series of discussion groups, hyper local. It seems to have only really spread within Texas and then kind of wherever H.L. Hunt had personal associates. So there was kind of a big chapter in Nebraska. There was another chapter in Virginia, right? Kind of around as his social circle spread. So if you've heard at all of Facts Forum, you've probably heard of them because it became a radio and television production. So once Hunt realized that the discussion group wasn't going to scale up, he started creating radio programming and ultimately TV programming as well. And so throughout its kind of 6 or 7 years of existence, Facts Forum spent around $3 million or so on programming that yielded $5 million or so a year in airtime, free airtime. Now, the reason this is important is Facts Forum ran programming that fulfilled the balance imperative of the Fairness Doctrine. So again, this is only a year or two after the Fairness Doctrine is created, and H.L. Hunt basically creates free programming that if you're a local broadcast station owner and you need to fulfill this new requirement, you can do it for free. You don't have to pay somebody to produce programming or produce it yourself. Now, importantly, this programming was biased in favor of Hunt's ideology, right? So it balanced both sides. He hired a man named Dan Smoot, who was a former FBI agent in Texas. And Dan Smoot would basically get up there and say, okay, here's a question, right? On one hand, you say, the right-wing perspective of it, and it would be very eloquent and articulate. And then he'd give the kind of liberal perspective on it, and it'd be kind of like boring and not very eloquent and that sort of thing, right? So it was both sides, but rhetorically slanted in favor of the right-wing perspective, right? The right anti-communist perspective. So again, two things here. One, it's super important that the first mobilization of the modern conservative movement was about people telling conservatives, you're smart, you're critical, you're the ones who have the facts on your side. Let's get together and engage in media criticism together, right, at a grassroots level. Once that doesn't work because it doesn't scale up, you then create a version of it that is palatable for radio and television, right? Now, by 1953, 54, this is after a few years, after it's really starting to go national. I mean, you have millions of viewers. It's going all across the country, including in the Philippines, right? They're broadcasting all over the place. In 1953, December 1953, Ben Bagdikian, another former dean of the Berkeley School of Journalism, right? At that point, he was working for the Providence Journal. He was an investigative reporter. And he wrote a multi-part series on Facts Forum, basically calling it a right-wing front. And so this was published in late 53 into 54, and it got syndicated. Time Magazine ran it. The Associated Press picked it up, went viral in contemporary parlance, right? Now, this is a really crucial moment because not only are these conservatives that are kind of starting to engage with Facts Forum, not only are they engaging in media criticism, all of a sudden the press itself is coming for them, right? Is saying that thing that you think is interesting, that you like to listen to, it's biased, you're wrong, right? You're bad. So it isn't just, oftentimes when we talk about conservatives' disbelief of the press, right? We talk about it in an abstract fashion or as though it's instrumentalist. But it's really important that the very first conservative mobilization actually had the press critiquing it, right? In a way that made the press not seem abstractly biased against them, but literally coming for them. It's also worth noting that before Bagdikian wrote his series, The Worker, the Communist Party publication, had already done a few hit pieces on Facts Forum as well. So what H.L. Hunt and all the people that worked for Facts Forum saw was, oh, the mainstream press is now taking on the Communist Party line. That was the way that they interpreted that, right? So this expose, which was true and accurate, right, nevertheless stokes that fear and confirms the priors of the conservatives that were at that very moment starting to mobilize. Now, this conflict with the press, which I argue kind of initiates with Facts Forum and the coverage, critical coverage around it, because if you look at the later issues of Facts Forum magazine, their magazine, it really shifts gears after the Bagdickian hit to being much more openly hostile towards the press and pointing out moments where the press is critical of them, right, as evidence, right? Another important thing, really quick, I'll note about this is that they engage in this kind of amateur public opinion polling at the time as well, where they would have polls that would ask questions similar to the ones that Gallup and Roper would ask. And then they would only poll Facts Forum participants. And lo and behold, the press is saying McCarthy is evil and doing all this bad stuff, but Facts Forum people think that McCarthy is doing great, right? And so they're starting to illustrate the gap between the conservative worldview, the right anti-communist burgeoning worldview, and the way the world was being reported in the press, right? So this was a very crucial moment in the development of what I call in the book a conservative critical disposition toward the press. Now, that disposition then gets taken up once you have William F. Buckley and the National Review and Young Americans for Freedom and all that conservative movement apparatus that you may be more familiar with from earlier accounts. All of that builds upon the work that Facts Forum did. For example, William F. Buckley promoted the formation of National Review on Facts Forum. He actually was on Facts Forum debating whether or not the media was biased in 1954-55 as he was working to build National Review. So it isn't even just saying that, oh, this happened and then this happened. Literally, the people that were working with National Review or with Facts Forum end up in populating both the John Birch Society and the more respectable corners of the conservative movement itself by the 1950s into the 1960s. Now, this continues throughout the 1960s, which gets us to this guy who you may be more familiar with, right? So Spiro Agnew gave a very famous speech in 1969 that critiqued the television coverage of Richard Nixon's Vietnamization speech. This was a speech where Nixon got up there and said, hey, we're going to be scaling back U.S. military on the ground in Vietnam. We're going to be using more local troops, right? And so the press panned this speech, but the popular support for the Vietnam War really increased after that. I think Nixon's approval ratings went from 50% to 70% after that, right? But that wasn't enough for Nixon, right? He sends Agnew out. Agnew gives two speeches, one in Des Moines and one in Montgomery, Alabama, actually, in the fall of 1969, saying basically the press is biased, right? They're biased against Nixon. They're biased against the war. Now, oftentimes people look at those as the kind of beginnings of the liberal media claim, right? Because Nixon was so hostile toward the press that often is, where there's a lot of smoke or fire or whatever, that's where people tend to look. But what I reframed the Agnew moment as not necessarily the beginnings of the liberal media critique, but actually the culmination of 20 years of activism internal to the right, right? And so by the time Agnew is talking, to national audiences about the media being biased, he's sharing an idea that took 20 years to cook, right, among the conservative movement, and he makes it go extra viral, right, among people outside of the modern conservative movement. Now, including, by the way, the press, right? And so after Agnew's speech, if you look at editor and publisher in the Columbia Journalism Review, right, what you see is some criticism, right? Some people saying, well, Agnew's gone too far, or this is censorship, right? There's a whole lot of opposition to it. But then over the course of the coming months, you start to see a lot of introspection, right? Where you'll have CJR in January of 1970, right, comes out with a series of different interviews with leading journalists and journalism professors at the time and says, well, but aren't people starting to trust the press a little bit less? This is around the time where you're starting to get people saying that television journalism was, all negative and was, superficial and wasn't sufficient and all these sorts of things. So a lot of journalists and journalism industry types start to look at Agnew's critique and this critique coming from the right and then generalizing from it, right? What can we learn about our audiences from the fact that these conservatives are being so hostile or so oppositional, right? If you look back to when trust in the press studies, right? So if you look now to see, do people trust the press, right? Those polls start in the 1970s, and they start because Agnew, and they start because the right raises the topic and issue. So all of the kind of debate and deliberation about how do we get audiences to trust us more? How do we write stories that are more appealing to people that are tuning out of journalism, right, or tuning out of the news? All of those conversations really start as a result of this right-wing pressure. Now, another really important development within journalism that takes place during the 70s is the emergence of the National News Council. This is created in 1973 through 1984, lives about a decade. It's created by the 20th Century Fund, I think, was the initial funder of it. But the National News Council was basically an ombudsperson designed to hold the national media accountable to the public. Now, the reason that the National News Council is important is because the same year that Spiro Agnew gives his speech in 1969, in fact, 2 months before Spiro Agnew gives his speech, another guy that we need to talk about gets involved. That's Reed Irvine there up top. Phyllis Schlafly, we'll talk about her in just a second as well. So Reed Irvine in 1969 creates an organization called Accuracy in Media. Funnily enough, Accuracy in Media was a spin-off of a luncheon group in Washington, D.C. by a bunch of anti-communists called the McDowell Luncheon Group. This was tightly affiliated with an anti-communist group called the Council Against Communist Aggression, or CACA, which is the funniest possible acronym for an anti-communist organization, especially one that was very focused on Latin America. Apparently didn't speak Spanish, but in any event, Reed Irvine and his colleagues create Accuracy Media in 1969. Agnew gives a speech a few months later in November, right? And so they're able to ride that popularity that Agnew gives to this idea of the media being biased, and then goes out and starts producing evidence of liberal media bias, right? So they create a newsletter, they write a lot of letters to the editors, they engage in shareholder activism, all to convince folks that the media is biased against conservatism, against capitalism, against U.S. imperialism abroad. They wouldn't say, U.S. imperialism abroad, but you know what I mean, right? Now, getting back to the National News Council, in 1973, right, which by that point, this was kind of a heyday in some respects of Accuracy Media. They were really, running on all cylinders by that point, really making some money and getting some prestige. They reach out to the National News Council and they start to use the National News Council as a way of laundering their appeals to make them seem as though they're coming from a neutral arbiter. And if you look at the papers of the National News Council, which are at the University of Minnesota, I went there as well, what you see in internal memos and conversations is debates saying, hey, this Accuracy in Media group has their own ulterior motives here. We need to tread really carefully. But they were really anxious that AIM would tar them as biased and then it would discredit their entire project. And so in the early days of the National News Council, they actually took up some of the AIM critiques and then validated them, right? I think as a way of, making AIM placated a bit. AIM is incapable of being placated, right? And so it keeps going with it. Ultimately, this becomes a problem. And AIM finally says that National News Council is biased, right? So all of this is in the book as well. But the reason why I'm focusing on the National News Council and the reason why I'm focusing on CJR and editor and publisher is the liberal media claim couldn't exist if journalists hadn't taken it seriously, right? If journalism as an industry didn't see or feel a little bit of something, right, about, oh, well, maybe we are biased, or maybe we aren't doing it quite right, or we could improve in some way with our audiences, right? And so, again, the way that the liberal media claim has often been narrated is though it was created by the right, but it really couldn't exist without journalism kind of meeting them halfway. Now, getting back to this idea of balance, right? So this is all during the time period of the fairness doctrine. Oftentimes we look back fondly, not me, but we, liberal progressive people, whatever it would be, look back fondly on the fairness doctrine, right? And I think that's because this idea of balance seems really intuitively good, right? Well, both sides get to speak their part. We don't have these kind of like right-wing media like we have to this day, right? But part of what the book shows is that actually the fairness doctrine, although it seems like a nice progressive thing, ends up doing and serving the bidding of right-wing media activists more than liberal ones. Liberal ones also benefit in some regards as well. But both Phyllis Schlafly and Reed Irvine use the fairness doctrine to basically get their party line right onto the news. Schlafly used this to really successful effect in opposing the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. And interestingly, when in 1987, in the 1980s and broadly, when the Reagan administration is thinking of getting rid of the fairness doctrine, both Reed Irvine and Phyllis Schlafly come up and say, don't get rid of it. We need it, right? We need it to get conservative ideas onto the airwaves, right? Now, Paul Weyrich, who was another conservative activist who founded the Heritage Foundation, et cetera, he said we should get rid of it because I think he saw some potential that you could have a broadcast network, TV, radio network that was right-wing. Lo and behold, you get rid of the fairness doctrine, and in 1988, a year later, Rush Limbaugh takes off, right? Conservative talk radio. So part of what the book is doing is it's kind of challenging our preconceived notions of a lot of mid-20th century history, of political and media history, that basically looks back as though it's a halcyon period, right? That was in the good times when people still trusted the news and there was relative epistemological stability. Part of what I find is there was all kinds of instability, right? All kinds of media criticism and activity going on during this time period. And And the idea of liberal media bias is the kind of the accrual of all of that debate and discussion. The fact that we still have ideas of media bias or liberal media bias to this day is a legacy of the fairness doctrine in these kind of balance imperatives of that era. So this brings us all back to Morris Ernst. And I'm almost out of time, so this is a good timing. So in 1972, Morris Ernst, who at this point was writing a local newspaper column for The Villager in New York, he was like semi-retired to some degree. In 1972, he contacted Accuracy in Media, asking for materials because he was interested in their work. So cold email, or not email, pre-email, cold letter, right? Saying, hey, I think I might be interested in your work. Let me see if I can help you. At first, Accuracy Media didn't seem to know who he was and gave him the cold shoulder, right? Didn't respond. And so Ernst replied again and said, hey, I really want to know you guys. I think I might be helpful to you, right? So after the second letter, they realize who he is and they welcome him to join their board of directors. And the reason they were so excited ultimately is that they realized that Ernst was a liberal, right? And that they were getting a lot of flack that Accuracy Media was a right-wing front, it was conservative, et cetera. And they saw this as a potential to basically mitigate for that, right? Now, one way to argue here is that Morris Ernst is kind of like Eugene Lyons or Ralph de Toledano, right? His politics shifted rightward over time, right? And so he joins the conservative movement. But that doesn't seem to have been the case. If you actually look at his archive, which I did, and you look at kind of his overall oeuvre, he was still basically a civil libertarian. His primary goal from the 1940s, or earlier than that, even all the way up to the 1970s, was basically investment in a marketplace of ideas, right? And a disagreement with monopoly and the kind of shrinking of the marketplace of ideas. And so, part of what Ernst does, or part of what Ernst illustrates, is that the discourse around him shifts from the 40s to the 1970s. In the 1940s, he was aligned in the progressive media reform movement in common cause with communists. He was opposed to those communists. That's part of why he became an anti-communist, I would imagine. But he nevertheless was in common cause with them during the Popular Front era. By the 1970s, if he's looking around to say who's critiquing the media, who's saying that there's structural media bias and that we need to increase our pluralism of the news, it was the right that was doing that, right? And so even though his political ideology doesn't shift, the fact that in the 40s he's working in common cause with leftists and in the 80s or 70s he's working in common cause with the right is illustrative of the broader discursive shift that I chart the path in the book. So the main takeaway here, the idea of liberal media bias has roots in the progressive media reform movement, and it has been sustained by progressives, liberals, and especially professional journalists by idealizing objectivity and being open to considering bias complaints, especially from the right. Counteracting the conservative critical disposition toward the press requires not doubling down on objectivity, nor on pointing out that right-wing media is biased, right? Media Matters for America has been doing this for a decade now. It doesn't do all that much of a difference, right? By and large, people that consume conservative media know it's biased. That's why they're consuming it, right? So we need to get beyond the bias claim. We need to get back to overt and direct acknowledgement of where and why we disagree. We need more political conflict, not less. As a norm, objectivity is fundamentally apolitical, or anti-political rather. It dreams of a world of consensus where political disagreement is reduced to a bare minimum, but there are real and stark disagreements in this country over who we are and what we should be doing. The right knows this and knows that staying within the bias paradigm helps their cause. It allows them to engage in politics while liberals and journalists try to avoid it. It's time to acknowledge and embrace the political, to craft and advocate for a clear egalitarian vision, not a return to some mythical consensus around some objective reality. Thank you. Oh, and I'll leave it on that slide. This is a painting, by the way, that I wanted to use for my book, but I didn't want to pay the artist. He is a painter in Provo, Utah. He's a Mormon painter who's gotten really into right-wing political art in the last since the Tea Party era, 10, 15 years. But this is my favorite of his, which is the press are literal clowns, and Trump is doing them. So I think that this is funny, but not for the same reasons that he does, presumably. So we'll leave that with you for our discussion.
Well, thank you. Bravo. That was extraordinary in many ways. But having read your book, you've given a kind of overview of a very detailed story of, we have a few of these characters, and you talk about a number of them in the book, and all in this notion that, to try to account for the emergence of right-wing media, we have to look at what the left was doing. And as a person who has studied the right, and in particular fascism, over the course of years, it reminded me of the early 20th century, in which, for example, in Italy, you had the rise of the Italian nationalist movement, which in many ways was one of the currents which led into fascism. And they very self-consciously were copying the Italian Socialist Party. They took on, hey, that looks like a good idea. Or how do you get moved from an ideology to a mass movement, to a movement? And in your book and in your talk, that kept coming to mind for me. I think and in the book you also refer to people who move from the left to right. Perhaps the model figure of that is in fact Mussolini, who had been the editor of the Socialist Party daily before he founded fascism. Any case, so I think I read this as grounded in a kind of well-known historical arc, and I think that makes it very strong.
Thank you.
You know, I remember, one of the. Oh, let me say first that I want to recommend the book.
Thank you.
Among other things, it's very well written, and somewhere along the line you'll say, "Oh, that's right, he's a journalist." There are not those sentences where you go, "What the hell was that about? What did he say there?" So I want to shout out how successful I think the book is.
Thank you.
Okay. Um, One of the very few virtues of getting old is that you kind of remember some of the things that were in the book. I recall, now this is somebody who isn't in the book, in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, I think, the senator from North Carolina called Jesse Helms.
Yep, Jesse.
Jesse Helms, I can recall. Pardon me? Have I brought back bad memories? No. Um, and I have this very, very strong memory of Jesse Helms telling his followers, "Let's buy CBS."
Yep.
And you refer here and there to some currents which attempted to, okay, we're going to everybody buy one share of CBS, and we'll go to the meetings and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering, and I suppose other people will bring up the question of, okay, from what you've written here, let's move to the current moment, okay, in which CBS has in fact been bought.
Yes.
And it's been bought by a fellow traveler of Trumpism, and not only that, but Trump is also talking about pulling the licenses of network.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you more about the network news and it having been superseded. But can you bring to bear or on the question of, from where you go, how have we leaped to what we are now seeing from Trump world?
Yeah, so thank you, Larry, for all of this. I'm a better writer than I'm a talker, so I'll try my best to meet up with that as well, by the book. So one of the main takeaways of the book, one of the main arguments, is that it isn't necessarily that the right has like the better ideas or that they have more money. They do have a lot of money. That helps, right? Um, but for me, what I argue is that primarily what the right does that's successful is that they're like relentlessly opportunistic. They're iterative. They throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and sees what sticks. Some of the stuff doesn't stick. Plain talk you've probably never heard of because it didn't stick. Like it was very successful and useful for one specific thing, and it didn't do that much after that, right? Human events still exist. National Review still exists, right? Facts Forum is defunct, right? So some things succeed.
Whereas hee-haw is another matter.
Exactly. So it's opportunistic, it's iterative, and it's constantly trying new things, right? And so one of those things that it tried historically, right? And part of this is that when the right is always looking to the left to see kind of what the horizon of possibility is. If you look, for example, at the papers of the American Conservative Union, which are also at BYU in Provo, along with Accuracy Media's papers, early documents is William F. Buckley circulating around about the Americans for Democratic Action, right, which is a progressive group in the 40s that was very good and successful, 50s it was very good and successful, and they said, we need to replicate this, right? Part of my research for this book was interviewing Richard Viguerie, who is a famous direct mail pioneer for the right, who graciously talked to me for about an hour. He also said, right, we used to look at the left and replicate it, reverse engineer the left is the way he would say it. And I asked him, I said, Richard, were you doing like Gramsci reading groups? Like what do you mean reverse engineering the left? And he's like, no, we never did any of that kind of stuff. Like we would just look and survey the terrain and see. And so it's like, he didn't read Gramsci, but he was like doing Gramsci, right? Like he like understood intuitively Gramsci in some ways. But in any event, so the right is constantly surveilling what's available to them, both in terms of what the left is doing, also in terms of regulations. Like if you look at H.L. Hunt, he was like, oh, we can take advantage of this fairness doctrine thing, actually, right? And so that opportunism, I think, is the driving force of the right. And this gets us back to this idea of CBS. So there is some work. I don't talk about Helm. There's actually a really good book about Jesse Helm's media activism. So I kind of wrote around that book a little because somebody else has already written it. Brian Harden, I think, wrote it. But in any event, he was advocating for taking over CBS, shareholder activism, Accuracy Media was. Also, the John Birch Society in the 1960s, there was a guy named David Dye who was based in Lubbock, Texas, who led this thing called Media Unlimited or Media Limited or something like that. There was a similar kind of scheme to basically buy some controlling share of CBS. But if you think about it, right, this was a relatively wealthy businessman in Texas. He had enough money to buy some shares of CBS. He was hoping that like a bunch of other conservatives would buy it too. And I think his goal was like getting like 12% ownership share because I think he thought that that would be enough that they could, shake their weight around, right? That was the scale of possibility for them right at the time, based upon how much money they had, what, how powerful CBS was, et cetera. The regulations about who can own what, et cetera. Now the Ellisons, like they've got the money to buy outright. They've got the clout in Washington with CBS or with Trump to buy it outright, right? And so what we're facing now is a moment. Victor Picard talked about this on the Media the other day. I think he's right, of media capture, right? And the reason that we're at a period of media capture now isn't because the right has a new idea, right? They've always wished that they could control the media in full. They just didn't think it was possible, right? They didn't have any possibility of doing that. They either didn't have the money or they didn't have the connection to regulation, right? And so they were always operating throughout most of the book in the 20th century within what was the horizon of the possible, and then trying to get as much of that as they could. What they ended up getting initially, right, was let's have a right-wing outlet, right? So we'll have Fox News or we'll have conservative talk radio, right? One among many within a pluralistic media environment. I think what we're seeing right now, which is so scary, and this is getting at, Skydance going to be buying CNN very soon as well, most likely, right? Is they're seeing an opportunity where they can no longer say, we're just going to control one little chunk within a pluralistic media environment. We have the resources and the capacity to take it all if we want. That, I think, is a pretty scary thing, but it isn't just because the right wants to do it. It's because of years of building institutional power, and then getting Trump in office and being able to kind of reshape the government in their image in a way. Anyway, if that helps.
Okay. Apropos of that, I have, for the last decade at least, been troubled by the right wing still talking about mainstream media as though why isn't Fox mainstream media given, by what definition is mainstream media? And I was thinking, you make a very good case for the surprising subversive quality of the fairness doctrine, but you also talk about its end in the Reagan years. And I thought it was very interesting, the legal argument, which was that the fairness doctrine made sense during a period in which there was media scarcity, based on things like, assigned frequencies and things of that nature. There is no longer media scarcity, and that was what allowed the right to argue for getting rid of it successfully. How can you square in any way, and this is often a difficult question, I'm asking you to make sense of how the right makes sense of things. In the absence of scarcity, how can they still maintain the notion that there is an MSM, as they often call it, mainstream media, and that they are not part of it?
And so I think that this gets back at the kind of fundamental role of this critical disposition toward the press in conservative sense of identity, right? And part of what I get at the book is that this allows for some bridging between like the more respectable corners of the modern conservative movement and the least respectable ones. So like the Buckleyite folks and the Birchers, right? But for, 80 years, right? What it means to be conservative means to have a certain kind of critical approach to the media. And so getting back to what I said earlier with objectivity as being this kind of empty signifier, so is mainstream. Like what does that even mean, as you point out, right? And so the whole critique isn't about this is what the media should be at in order to be doing its job properly. It's that, well, actually the only real reason or the only real way for them to do their job properly is if they're conveying the world through a right-wing lens, right?
So there's a quality still of one down feeling about it. I assume that's what you're implying when you say it's a matter of identity.
It's a feeling of identification, and that, let me put it this way too. One really fundamental difference between journalists as they approach the world and liberals in the last century in how they approach the world versus how conservatives tend to is conservatives have an idea in their head, right? That the social hierarchies, according to race, gender, class, et cetera, are natural. And that, the world ought to look in a certain kind of way. The world doesn't look that way. The world is much more complicated and pluralistic and messy than they envision it. And so it's kind of impossible to narrate the world in a way that's consistent with their ideology unless you share that ideology. And this is, I think, one reason why it ends up becoming a binary where it's like, well, either you're doing what Fox is doing, you're doing something that I agree with that appeals to the way I see the world or want to see the world, or you're not. And I think that often the role or the way that journalists approach that, right, is, well, what can we do that can meet them in the middle somewhere? And the answer is you can't meet them in the middle, actually. Like you'll just keep meeting in the middle, in the middle, in the middle until you're like reinforcing their worldview, right? Because it's fundamentally the modern conservative movement is not we're going to look at the world as it is and then fix the things that are broken in it. Mm-hmm. That's not the way that they approach it, right? It's we have a vision in our heads of what the world should look like, and we're going to try to make the world appear in that image in our heads. And the thing through most of the 20th century is that because of limited resources and because of other kinds of regulations and structures, they didn't have the capacity to do that at scale. I think increasingly they're getting closer to that capacity. Now, I think the benefit there is that the world is messy and pluralistic, and there's nothing that they can do to actually cause the world to be I mean, short of like eliminationist kinds of politics, which I think it's scary that we're getting closer towards more of that in our political life as well. But I think that that's part of the reason that we're where we're at now, right? Where you're seeing, leveraging ICE to incarcerate like large swaths of people, right? Or engaging in these kind of like quixotic military campaigns around the world, right? There's something going on that feels a lot more fashy, right? More to your area of research, right? And I think that that's the shared connection there, right? Is this we need to reconstruct the world in the image in our minds versus approaching the world as it is.
Thank you. I want to ask you one last thing and then we'll
Yep.
open it up, which is here's the thing I kept waiting for
Yeah.
in the book,
Yeah.
and it didn't happen, which is the effect of the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
I mean, in general, the the right was somewhat bound before the end of the Cold War to a pan-American, that is to say, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and so forth. You had Cold War liberals, that everybody was anti-communist. So there was, something, to some extent, there was something they participated in, if they were, extreme about it.
Yeah.
And so I have often regarded the end of the Cold War as a moment of liberation of the fringe,
Mhm.
that there was a sense in the extremes that we are no longer bound by the this is a Pete good God,
Hegseth, yeah.
Hegseth word. We're no longer bound by the niceties,
Right.
and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the extent to which the end of the Cold War is a similar kind of turning point in the story you're telling.
For sure. So the book is bookended by the fairness doctrine for a few reasons. One of which is once you get, and I gesture toward this toward the end, but like once you get Rush Limbaugh, there becomes a kind of reconfiguration of the power of the modern conservative movement, and you start to see kind of commercial logics playing in ways that I think actually support what you're suggesting, right? It kind of allows for it's more difficult for the conservative movement to police itself, right, in terms of what ideas it claims to stand for. Once you have somebody like Rush Limbaugh who doesn't consider himself a conservative or didn't consider himself a movement conservative and would say whatever he thought, right? So I don't approach the end of the Cold War specifically in the book, but um, I don't know. Mary Duziak has a great book called Cold War Civil Rights that's about the existence of the Soviet Union, right? Not saying it like so Stalinism was terrible, like the Soviet Union was responsible for untold amounts of suffering, right? But the pressure, the external pressure by the Soviet Union on the US and the competition over soft power in, Latin America and Asia and Africa, all kinds of places, right? Required modern conservatism to advocate for democracy as an capitalist and liberal democracy, especially as an alternative to socialism, right? That kept them bound to certain kinds of commitments that I think once you get rid of the Cold War, there's nothing holding them to that. And it took a while before we get to Trump now, where all bets are off. They're going to do whatever they want. It didn't happen immediately because part of it is like you've got people that grew up in the Cold War and they're still bound by those logics and those beliefs, right? I think part of what you're seeing now is a lot of folks who either don't care or didn't never cared about those beliefs to begin with, as well as a kind of younger generation of folks who see the end of the Cold War as a liberation in a way from that logic. And I think we're bearing the brunt of that now with a lot of the kind of like kind of new intellectuals around Trump justifying kind of might makes right politics again,
Yeah.
which is something that I think that the U.S. It isn't that the U.S. was too good for that during the Cold War. It's that the existence of the Soviet Union and their propaganda, and then the U.S. looking over its shoulders, like, oh, well, we don't want to look like we're fascist or whatever, caused a kind of mechanism that prevented it, prevented the escalation of it, and now we're all bets are off, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
By the way,
Yeah.
you mentioned in your book when talking about Rush Limbaugh that the place of and the importance of his success of being an entertainer,
Yeah.
which I found very significant.
Right.
And one immediately thinks, who is more entertaining
Yeah.
than Trump?
Right.
That he pulled that off. Okay. Do
Unfortunately.
we
Yeah.
have questions from either the remote or here? Let's start here.
Two quick ones. Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you.
So much to process. From a journalistic point of view, and I agree that the concept of objectivity,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily attainable.
Yeah.
And I'm a teacher of journalism.
Yeah.
How do we approach?
Yeah.
Should we continue to try to be balanced? I rather use the word balance
Yeah.
than objective.
Right.
And my other question, what's your point of view on radio? Wasn't radio the place where the right wing really reach out to the American public and really transform it to its ideology?
So yeah, first to the radio, the first question is a big question, so I'll come to that in a second. But the radio question, one of the things that stands out in the book is we often think of conservative talk radio as like a Rush Limbaugh and onward phenomenon, so 88 onwards. But the right had been experimenting and exploring the radio throughout the Fairness Doctrine era. And so I think that you're right that the right very early on saw the radio as a useful medium to them. I think there are a variety of different reasons for that. Some, I think, did have a sense that there was a sort of intimacy to radio that allows for you to convey certain emotion-laden messages, right? That is slightly different than how print lands. And so I do think that that does speak to that there are certain radio actors, not actors, but people that worked on radio that did think that, and others that just did it kind of instrumentalist way, right? Like it's an outlet to reach multiple or large numbers of people. But yeah, I think radio is key. Heather Hendershot has a great book called What's Fair on the Air that talks a lot about radio as well. The question about what's to be done, I think, is kind of what you're asking in terms of praxis. And I don't know. I mean, to one thing, if you look back to the progressive media reform movement in the 40s, there was a lot more conversation and investment in what can be done. So like I'm thinking about the Hutchins Commission for Freedom of the Press, which talked about social responsibility as a value for journalism, right? I think we could pick that back up, for example. What does social responsibility look like in a era where you have the right seizing large swaths of media, right? My concern is that for most of the last decade, so once Trump won in 2016, the major discourse that emerged was mis and disinformation, right? The mis and disinfo paradigm. There was a lot of money that got thrown into it, a lot of funding into fact checking and that sort of thing. It was never about facticity, whether something was true or not. And this gets back to this idea of hermeneutics and interpretation, right? It's what are the interpretive strategies that journalists are using? And so I think cultivating in our students an awareness of and a self-reflection, right? Of, well, maybe you're not political, or maybe you're trying to be impartial with your reporting or trying to be balanced, but what are the political effects of this, right? So let's say you write a story that is balanced. What are the effects of that balance politically, right? So it's about training journalists to think politically and to recognize that the work, even if they don't have an ideology that's going in, right? Regardless, the content has a political effect in the world, right? This is kind of in some ways a parallel to the idea of liberal media bias in the book, right? Whether or not you believe it or don't believe it doesn't matter. The fact that it is a discourse that is circulating has real effects in the world, regardless of whether you believe it or not. And so training our young journalists, right, to recognize that what you are doing is unavoidably political. You need to just make choices about where you're aligning. And as somebody who's on the left myself, I would say like, if your goal is to promote and advance like a right-wing politics, right, do that with your work. If you don't think that's good, right, even if you're not like a sectarian leftist of some sort or whatever, if you think that like right-wing authoritarianism is bad, right? Or is disadvantageous to you and your community, write stories that have an effect of undermining that some way. That doesn't necessarily mean writing polemically. It might just be thinking about in Alabama, what is this documentary that just got Oscar nominated? The Alabama Solution. I always say project, but that's not it. Alabama Solution. That's a very political film, right? And not necessarily because they were like going at the governor or something like that explicitly. It was like, let's just show you the conditions of what's going on in the state and then see what happens. And so I think a reinvestment in investigative journalism and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, it's an industry, journalism, right? And there aren't jobs and money in that. And so we really need a reassessment as an industry-wide reassessment, right, in the face of things.
I was going to take a question from
Oh, we got no card.
our remote audience. We ask here, in what ways do you see right-wing ethnic media as convergent or divergent from right-wing white media?
I would ask the person which specific media they're talking about, but
Yeah,
I think that's
that's
a really, if you are a graduate student and you're wanting to do a dissertation, you should do it on that. A good example, I mean, historically, there's some interesting examples of this with like, in the contemporary, like the Epoch Times, for example, which has really built itself as a kind of Trump media outlet, partly because they're related to like Falun Gong and like critical of Chinese communism, right? And so I think that there's a lot of really important research to do there. I don't have the language skills, unfortunately, to do some of that research myself, but no, I think that a comparison of like, you know, predominantly white versus primarily a specific ethnic group right-wing media content would be great and important. There's also the question of kind of like transnational comparative studies as well, which are starting to happen and need to happen more too.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah, on that note, I was going to ask about, I guess, post 1989
Yeah.
and 1991, we see an expansion of globalization.
Yeah.
And I think like this is me surmising. I would expect like a reconsolidation of borders, of like a securing of like a unified like national front in the face of this. But I do see like a occupation and tokenization of like ethnic bodies by the left.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, they've become kind of like ammunition in like a tete-a-tete between the left and the right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, how did globalization, how did the 90s onwards lead to like a particularly scary moment in the now?
Yeah. So one of the aspects of globalization that we don't often think about, but is important with the rise of right-wing media, is Rupert Murdoch, right? And so the reason that Rupert Murdoch was able to create Fox as a broadcast television, fourth network, which was thought to be impossible, and to create Fox News, right, as a competitor to CNN, was because he was able to leverage his global scale, right? The fact that he had built a media empire across Australia, Asia, and the UK, allowed him, for example, to run Fox News at a loss for 5 years, I think it was. Fox News didn't break even until I think it was January 2022, or not 2022, that's wrong, 2002, right? So after 9/11. And so by leveraging global media scale, right, these global media conglomerates, especially, and you see this with Skydance to some degree as well, right? You're seeing levels of wealth and resources that are able to play a quite different game than if you look back at like H.L. Hunt, who was very wealthy, had a lot of money as a millionaire, but was like creating programs. He wasn't buying networks. He wasn't creating new channels, right? And so I think that's one underlooked at aspect of globalization. So there are also like global cultural flows that we could talk about as well, but I think it's more in terms of the business side of things actually that impacted right-wing media flows. Thank you for that.
Oh. Just talk about it. Okay. So I was struck by talking about from Mussolini onward how how the right borrowed these ideas from the left,
Yep.
and they put them into practice.
Mhm.
I'd like to hear what you have to say on why the left doesn't borrow ideas from the left,
Mhm.
and put them into practice, because
Yeah.
it seems like, I mean, even as recently as the
No, he meant the
no,
left.
I meant no, I meant
yeah, I heard
if
you.
the left is inventing all this stuff,
Yeah.
and the right is using it, why isn't the left? I mean, as recently, I guess it's 50 years ago,
Yeah.
of the Vietnam War, there was a whole new media.
Yeah.
It was on college campuses and radicals and stuff like that.
Yep.
And they just threw out the establishment media and created their own.
Yeah.
But increasingly in the decades since then, what's coming from the left in terms of the topics that you've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that part of what the book narrates is the decline of the Popular Front, right, which was a coalition between liberals and communists, right, as you know, during the 30s and 40s. The Red Scare, this McCarthy period, right, I argue in the book, not only marginalizes a lot of important Popular Front figures like George Seldes, it also effectively salts the earth for future collaboration. And I think we really see that salting ongoingly, right? The kind of neoliberal or corporate shift of the Democratic Party under the Clinton administration onwards. I mean, you even see this with like, you know, and am I allowed to besmirch our governor Gavin Newsom in this space, right? Like, there's a lot of if you listen to like the way that liberal media, and I don't mean like liberal media like they do, I mean like MSNBC or whatever, there's a real aversion to left thought, right? People that are more radical or calling for bigger solutions than, you know, kind of neoliberal tweaking here and there. And I think what you're suggesting, I agree with, is, you know, the Democratic Party, the kind of liberal wings of the Democratic Party. One of the things that made FDR so successful was the collaboration between further left and liberal, the setting aside of differences by both leftists and liberals, right, towards common cause, in particular around civil rights and labor. And so those common causes may look different today. I don't know what those would be, but if I were in, you know, those various political meetings, which I'm not terribly much these days, I would be advocating for what are the one or two, three big issues that leftists and liberals are going to come together. We're going to overlook our differences and we're just going to focus on those. And that would, I think, be a smart move.
And then specifically how to use the media to do what you're suggesting?
I don't know. It doesn't have to be the media. This is the other kind of conceit of the book, is the right was able to kind of leverage its critique of the media to pretty good effect. But like, there's all kinds of politics that doesn't have to be mediated. And I think especially as we're seeing the, you know, not just media, but also the channels through which we circulate media, like Twitter, Meta, those sorts of things, increasingly owned by right-wing billionaires, right? You know, we might need to have more analog approaches that are more about like local meetings and building scale that way. I don't know what that looks like, but the future's unwritten, as they say. Is there another question over here?
Yeah,
Yep.
from the net.
From the net.
From the net.
From the World Wide Web.
Yeah, right-wing media are willing to use disinformation and propaganda in a way that left-wing media are not. You may or may not agree with that. Have we therefore moved beyond the quote marketplace of ideas and toward a war over truth, a war that the right is clearly winning?
We've always been at war over truth. It's just that one side has accepted and admitted that and the other hasn't. And if you, in 1992, Rush Limbaugh wrote his second book called See, I Told You So. He has an entire chapter on Gramsci, on the Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci. And he says, this guy's got this idea of culture war. We should do it, and we should do it better. And so and Andrew Breitbart was also a big fan of this, like the idea of culture war, the idea of fighting over truth and like trying to win is something the right
Politics is downstream
from culture, right?
culture.
All of these things the right has known for a very long time. And a lot of folks, not all folks on the left, but many folks in kind of power among liberals and leftists have not embraced that to the extent that we probably should. I don't know what that looks like, but something.
Do you have a
I
question?
think he's got a question.
Whoops. Oh,
And then we can go over. Yeah.
oh, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
AJ, thank you for this.
Thank you.
It was thoughtful and it was eloquent. Um, um, it's also what you've delivered, the outline you delivered us tonight was really more along the lines of an intellectual history of a kind of a bit of a food fight between some pivotal, thoughtful thinkers talking in the abstract about what the role of media should be and how they should be controlled. And until then you mentioned Agnew,
Yeah.
and without mentioning the word Vietnam. And it started me thinking that you've given us this history, and I'm kind of asking you to fill in some things you didn't give us tonight.
Of course.
Because you address this history of thought about the media without putting it into a policy context.
Yep.
These things always transpired against the backdrop of policies and programs and directions for the country that these various people wanted to see. Certainly the 70s, the 60s, and 70s couldn't really be understood without talking about Vietnam. The 60s can't be understood without talking about the civil rights movement and the attempt by the conservatives to bolster and retain this tottering white aristocracy in the Southeast.
For sure.
And the 50s can't be understood without understanding the panic that the right was feeling about the Cold War and about the belief that the intellectual establishment of this country had been corrupted by its long-standing flirtation with communism and Stalinism and all the rest. So what I'm asking you is putting this back in the context of fights over what this country is all about and where it should be heading. It wasn't just a matter of whether the media are objective. It was a matter of what do the media stand for and where are they directing the rest of the country.
For sure. And all of that filling in that you just very well did is in the book too. So read it and it'll be there. But so I have a chapter in the book called Beyond Buckley. And part of what I'm looking at in that chapter is conservative respectability politics during the civil rights era. And I look at a small hyperlocal outlet called the Birmingham Independent. And so both the Birmingham News and the Birmingham Post-Herald, the local papers at the time, were very opposed to Martin Luther King, were not supportive of the civil rights movement. The Birmingham Independent felt that they were. And they used a lot of anti-Semitic tropes, for example, because the Newhouse chain had bought the Birmingham News that, oh, well, these Northern Yankees are coming in and skewing our local newspaper coverage. And so there's extensive writing in the book about white supremacist critiques of the press, which they called the paper curtain, this idea that the national press was coming down and misrepresenting the white South and the kind of collegial relations between Black folks and white folks in the South to the detriment of all, right? And so rather than get into all of the details here, you raise a really crucial point that I also argue in the book, which is, and this is why I would push back a bit on the characterization of this as an intellectual history, because it's less intellectual history, more a history of ideas, right? Oftentimes, intellectual histories are focused on philosophy, right? These kind of abstract, like this is how people are thinking about, what conservatism is, right? Or what liberalism is. Part of what this book is saying is that throughout this entire process, throughout the 20th century, what those abstract ideas of conservatism were shaped by the quotidian news of the day, right? And how does that challenge or cause for a readjustment or reappraisal of those lofty ideologies? And so it's more a matter of where does the ideology meet the ground, right? And the day-to-day coverage, and how does that shape both our understanding of the day-to-day world and the bigger ideologies that we use to make sense of that world. And so part of it is it's an argument against kind of ideas first conservatism that says, well, like, oh, they were neoliberals and they mixed neoliberalism and anti-communism and traditionalism together in these abstract ways. It's saying this is the kind of friction that emerges when those abstract ideologies become used to try to interpret daily events, right? And constantly fail in some ways at that, and then shape the overall movement as well. So rather than saying that conservatism is these three intellectual traditions that merge together, it's saying actually it emerges out of the problem of trying to make the world connect to these bigger, loftier ideals. And so Vietnam's in the book. So is the civil rights movement. So is McCarthyism. All of these things are in there as well to unpack. Thank you.
We have a hard stop at 7:30.
Oh, a hard stop. Sorry.
And it is now 7:30.
The-
So
We all
please
turn into
join
pumpkins.
Please join me in thanking A.J. Bauer for an extraordinary